In October of 1973, I remember looking out across the hills behind the university campus, watching the wind press the yellow leaves flat against the sidewalk. That was the last season I saw my brother's face. He was supposed to meet me that weekend for lunch. Just a casual thing, soup and sandwiches at our aunt's house, but he never showed. No call, no note, no word. We waited until dusk, and then the phone rang. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from. Down in the comments and tap that like and subscribe if stories like this ever brushed past your hometown or your own life. Every click helps pull another forgotten name back into the light. My name's Karen Ellsworth. I'm 54 now, and I've lived in Ogden, Utah nearly my whole life. Back in 1973, I was just 17. My younger brother Daniel was the quiet one in the family. Book-smart polite never got into trouble. He was in his second year studying physics at the University of Utah. I still remember how proud our mom was when he got that national merit letter. She kept it in a manila envelope in her Bible, said it meant something, said it proved he was going somewhere. Daniel wasn't the type to brag about grades or talk much about himself. He loved math logic puzzles, German club meetings. He kept things neat, tidy, folded his laundry better than I did. On weekends, he'd sometimes come home to help Dad fix the roof or rake the leaves. Other times, he stayed in Salt Lake to study, but he always called. In those days, we didn't lock our front doors during the day. Kids rode their bikes to the corner store for milk. You could trust people, or at least you thought you could. Daniel had his routines. He always left early for class, wore the same green windbreaker when it got chilly. He carried his wallet in his front right pocket and kept his keys on a thin canvas lanyard. I can still hear the jingle of it when he'd walk through the house. There was a kind of comfort in the sameness of him. That fall, everything looked normal. The mountains were brushed in burnt orange, and Daniel had just helped Mom install storm windows over fall break. He joked about getting better at cooking college meals, which mostly meant canned chili and scrambled eggs. He was steady, predictable, and then something shifted. It was a Friday, October 12th. I was supposed to ride the train down that weekend and he was going to meet me on campus, but that night he didn't call. Mom noticed first, said she had a funny feeling. Dad told her not to worry, Daniel was a college kid. Probably just busy. But that wasn't Daniel. By Sunday, none of us had heard from him. His roommate called Dr. Stephen Warren now, though back then he was just Steve. He said Daniel hadn't been back to the dorm since Friday afternoon. His car was still in the lot. And then he said something that made my blood go cold. He'd found Daniel's wallet just sitting there in the grass behind the science building. ID still inside. A few crumpled bills, untouched. That was when we knew something was wrong, really, truly wrong. And whatever had happened to Daniel, it hadn't been an accident. Steve's voice on the phone was steady, but there was something in it. Something measured, like he was trying not to scare us before he knew what he was dealing with. He said he'd called Daniel's professors after Daniel missed his physics lab, then walked the campus looking for him when no one had seen him. That's when he found the wallet half buried in the grass behind the old science building. Not near a bench or path. Just there, under a scatter of leaves. He picked it up, opened it, saw the student ID and a few crumpled bills, and knew something was off. Daniel never lost things, never misplaced anything. Steve said he tried not to panic at first, but when Daniel's bed still hadn't been slept in by Saturday night, he called campus police, and then he called us. Dad drove down that same evening. I remember Mom ironing Daniel's good church shirt and folding it into a paper bag like he might need it when he turned up. We didn't talk about the wallet. Nobody wanted to say what we were all thinking. Dad didn't get back until late. I heard the door click shut, heard the silence stretch. When I came down the next morning, he was sitting at the table staring at nothing. The bag with Daniel's shirt was still in the passenger seat of the car, unopened. That Monday, campus security started their formal report. Officers walked through the dorm, checked his room. His notebooks were still stacked neatly on the desk, textbooks open to the last page he'd read. The calendar on the wall was marked for a midterm coming up. He'd even drawn a little box around it in blue ink. Nothing had been packed. His toothbrush was dry. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken windows or forced doors, just absence. By midweek, local law enforcement joined in. Volunteers printed flyers. I remember standing on the sidewalk outside the bookstore with a stack of them, handing them to students who looked past me like I was asking for spare change. Some took them, some didn't. A few stopped to ask questions. Most just kept walking. The police searched the immediate campus grounds first. Then they moved out toward the foothills. It was already turning cold that October, and the air up there felt different, thinner, sharper. Teams hiked through the brush and rocky trails above the city, calling Daniel's name. Helicopters circled overhead for 2 days. Nothing. They checked hospitals and clinics in case he'd been injured. Checked the bus station, the airport. No tickets, no sightings, no withdrawals from his bank account. We kept waiting for someone to come forward to say they'd seen him walking across the quad, or getting coffee, or anything. Instead, rumors started. One student swore they'd seen Daniel getting on a bus downtown alone, carrying nothing. Another thought he saw him walking near the canyons, but couldn't remember exactly when. Every tip contradicted the last. The only thing that never changed was the silence that followed. None of the sightings could be confirmed. Most of them didn't hold up after a single question. By November, you could feel the shift. The tone in the investigators' voices grew more clipped. The energy behind the search started to wane. They said they were still working the case, but we could see the reality. No new leads, no new reports. Just a case file with Daniel's name on it, slowly sliding toward the back of the drawer. Then came the questions. Had Daniel been acting differently? Had he seemed withdrawn? Depressed? One officer asked if he'd ever talked about running away, starting over somewhere. Another mentioned suicide. I remember staring at him when he said that, how casually the word left his mouth, like he wasn't talking about my brother, but about someone hypothetical. Someone disposable. I told him no. Daniel had plans. He'd already registered for spring semester. He was saving up for a used car. We were going to go in together on a second-hand desk for his apartment next year. But they kept asking. Not accusing, not exactly, but narrowing. As if the absence of evidence meant the burden was now on us to explain his disappearance. They asked about friends. Daniel didn't have many. He wasn't antisocial, just quiet. He liked his study groups, like the guys in German club. He'd get lunch with Steve sometimes, or walk with classmates after lecture. But there wasn't anyone close enough to offer real insight. The longer it dragged on, the messier it got. The official timeline began to fray. One report said Daniel was last seen Friday morning. Another placed him in the student union that afternoon. A third, written weeks later, listed the wrong dorm entirely. Files went missing. Notes were incomplete. And because this was 1973, nothing was digitized. Just loose papers in a manila folder, already starting to yellow around the edges. The winter that followed was gray in a way I still can't describe. Days passed, then weeks, then months, and Daniel's name slowly stopped appearing in conversations, on the news, in the hallways. By early 1974, there was nothing left but a cardboard box in the back of a police storeroom and a family still leaving the porch light on. Mom called the station every Sunday, just to check, just in case. She'd always ask the same question. Has anyone found him? And they'd always answer the same way. We'll let you know if we hear anything. But the calls grew shorter, colder. Eventually, they stopped picking up altogether. By the time spring came around, we knew what they hadn't said. The search was over. No announcement, no closure, just silence. I remember walking through the old bookstore on campus that April, picking up a copy of the student paper out of habit. There was a feature on graduating seniors, and just below it, tucked in a corner near the classifieds, a one-line update: University police continue to investigate the 1973 disappearance of sophomore Daniel Ellsworth. That was the last time I saw his name in print. The campus moved on. New students arrived. The leaves came back. But the weight never lifted from our house. Not for Mom. Not for me. Not for Steve, who still called once in a while to check in. He said he couldn't shake the feeling that they'd missed something, that something simple, something obvious had been right in front of them all along. And he wasn't wrong, because 50 years later, in a quiet doctor's office just off South Temple, Steve would remember something no one else had, and that memory would change everything. After Steve brought up the search area, it was like a door cracked open, but not for everyone. Not at first. He and I had spoken on and off through the years, usually around the anniversary or when another article popped up online about some unidentified remains being found somewhere in the state. Most of them led nowhere. A few had been confirmed within days, but we always checked just in case. Steve never stopped feeling responsible, I think. Not for what happened, there was never anything to suggest he had anything to do with it, but for being the last one to see Daniel. For finding the wallet. For being the person who made that first call. And yet, when he brought up that old trail near the base of Black Mountain, the one they'd searched over and over back in '73, no one in the current department knew what he was talking about. It hadn't been mapped in the file. There wasn't a single photo or report marking it. No mention of that part of the range in the surviving logs. Just a faded topographical map with a few circles drawn in pencil, the kind that could have meant anything. An idea, a guess, or just someone trying to look like they were doing something. That was the part that sat wrong with me. Not just the disappearance, but how quickly the trail behind it had gone cold. Not because we lacked answers, but because people had simply stopped looking. I started calling again in 2018. After enough years pass, you stop expecting anything to come from it, but you keep trying because the alternative is to accept that the most important person in your life can just vanish. I didn't call to demand anything. I asked for copies of the reports, or what was left of them. Most were gone. Some had been misfiled, others lost in a move when the department changed locations in the late '80s. A few pages remained a scanned intake form, one incomplete summary from the week after Daniel was reported missing, and a newspaper clipping that had been taped into the folder. That was it. They told me the case was still technically open, but it hadn't been reassigned in years. No active leads, no one reviewing it. I offered to provide a DNA sample. It wasn't a decision I made lightly. It felt strange, like I was giving up something final, even though I knew I had nothing left to hold on to. They walked me through the process. A cheek swab, then a form. They submitted it into the system that catalogs unidentified remains from across the country. It didn't take long. A few weeks later, they called to say there were no matches. Nothing had come back. I remember hanging up the phone and sitting down on the edge of my bed. It wasn't grief, not exactly. It was that quiet ache of staying too long in the same question. But I also knew something had shifted. For the first time in decades, Daniel's name had been typed into a computer. Someone in that office had looked at it again. Maybe just for a few minutes. Maybe only because I'd called. But it mattered. I didn't know it then, but the case file, what little of it remained, was about to land in front of someone new. Her name was Nicole Mitchell. She'd just been hired as a crime data analyst for the University Police Department in 2022. It wasn't a special position tied to any case in particular, just a long overdue attempt to organize their archives, clean up old records, and modernize what hadn't been touched in decades. From what I later learned, she was meticulous, not dramatic, not the kind of person to chase ghosts. But when she came across Daniel's folder, thin-faded and half empty, she didn't ignore it. She read what she could. She asked questions. Why hadn't the case been flagged for follow-up? Why weren't there proper logs of the original search teams or an updated timeline of Daniel's last known movements? When she brought it to Major Heather Starnes, she expected a shrug. But Heather didn't brush it off. Heather had been with the department for over 20 years. She'd worked missing persons before. She knew the difference between an unsolvable case and one that had been abandoned. She didn't assign it out. She took it herself. Not because she expected to solve it, but because something about the gaps unsettled her. Together, she and Nicole began rebuilding the timeline. They tracked down archived class schedules, requested long-retired student directories, and went through old campus security memos, most of them scanned from microfiche or pulled from off-site storage. They found notes Daniel had written for a group project in late September, a professor's attendance sheet that confirmed he'd been in lecture the morning of October 12th, a dorm maintenance request from the week before about a leaky window in his room. None of it told them where he went, but it confirmed something crucial Daniel hadn't planned to disappear. Then came the chance meeting. Heather was taking her daughter to a routine doctor's appointment that December. A clinic not far from the university, the kind that sees hundreds of people a week. She was making small talk with the physician, just another appointment on a long day. But when he mentioned that he'd attended the university in the early 70s, her ears perked up. When he said his name, Stephen Warren, she stopped the conversation entirely. "Did you happen to know Daniel Ellsworth?" she asked. And his face changed. Steve told her everything he remembered. The Friday, Daniel didn't come back. The walk through campus, the wallet, the search in the hills. And most important, the trail they followed back then, the one not on any official record. A cut between two ridges near the base of Black Mountain. He described it in detail, where they started, how long they hiked, which landmarks they passed. He even remembered the way the air changed when they moved past the tree line. None of that had ever been recorded. But now, it was in Heather's hands. By the time she got back to her office, she and Nicole were already planning to send a request to search the area again 50 years later. Because for the first time in half a century, someone had put Daniel's story back on the map. And this time, they weren't going to let it fade. After Heather and Nicole logged Steve's description of the trail, it became clear how much had been missed. Not just details, but direction. Entire portions of the original search area had either been recorded vaguely or omitted altogether. The paper trail left behind after Daniel vanished was more like a scattering of footprints, some overlapping, some going nowhere. Even now, as someone who's lived with this for over 50 years, I still can't tell you what exactly broke down in those first critical days. Miscommunication overworked departments, changing hands between campus security and city police. It all blurred into something that couldn't hold its shape. What I do know is that after that conversation with Steve Heather, didn't file the memory away for later. She flagged it, and she brought it back into the conversation quietly, but firmly. There was no formal announcement, no press release. Just two women at a desk scanning old maps and pulling weather data from the week Daniel disappeared. I was still teaching part-time by then, filling in where needed at the local middle school. It was late January when I got a message on my answering machine, just a soft-spoken voice asking if I had a few minutes to talk about my brother's case. I called back the next day and spoke with Nicole first. She didn't rush. She explained that she and Heather were working through old cold cases tied to the university, and that Daniel's file, what little remained, was one of the few they were revisiting. I asked what had prompted that after all these years. She paused, then said, "Sometimes things fall between the cracks. We're trying to pull them back out." She told me they had questions about the area Daniel might have gone hiking in. I asked if they meant the canyons or the hills near the reservoir. She said neither. They were looking at Black Mountain, specifically the old slope trail that Steve mentioned. I remember that name from the early days when the search crews were still out, but I hadn't heard it mentioned in decades. I told her we'd always believed Daniel might have walked up into the foothills to clear his head. He'd done it before, but I never knew how far that idea had actually been followed. Heather reached out herself a few days later. Her voice reminded me a little of our Aunt Norma, steady measured, the kind of person who waits until you're finished speaking before she starts. She told me they were preparing to coordinate a new site assessment. Nothing official yet, just a plan to get someone up there once the snow cleared and the ground was easier to manage. She didn't make promises. She didn't speculate. But she listened. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay there, turning the idea over and over. Daniel, 20 years old, climbing up a rocky trail alone. The last few weeks before he vanished had seemed normal to all of us. But once the question had been asked, it was hard not to examine things differently. I thought about the quiet moments, how he'd lingered longer on the porch steps after dinner, how his phone calls felt a little more clipped. At the time, we'd chalked it up to school pressure. Physics wasn't an easy program, but now I found myself wondering if he'd been carrying something heavier, something he hadn't wanted to say out loud. In the spring of that year, I visited the old campus for the first time in decades. Some of the buildings had been renovated, but others looked exactly as they had the last time I walked them with Daniel. The science building where his wallet was found had new windows, but the concrete planters out front were the same. I stood beside one and looked out toward the street. I couldn't see the trailhead from there, but I knew the direction of it, how it sloped up into the brush, how easy it would be to disappear behind those trees. You didn't need a lot of imagination, just the willingness to keep walking. Back in Ogden, I kept waiting for the phone to ring again. Part of me dreaded it, part of me needed it. There's a specific kind of silence that sets in after decades of waiting. It's not passive, it's work. It takes effort to maintain. You go about your life, raise your family, try to be grateful for what you still have. But the absence. Daniel's absence was always in the background. Every time a body was found anywhere in the state, my heart stopped. Even when the age didn't match, or the clothes were wrong, or the condition made identification impossible, I'd wait for a name, just in case. When Heather finally called again, it was mid-October. A group of local hunters had been hiking just below the summit ridge of Black Mountain when they noticed what they thought were animal bones. When they got closer, they realized it was human, a partial skull exposed by erosion. They'd marked the spot and notified authorities that same day. It took less than 48 hours for Heather's team to secure the site. They moved quietly, respectfully. No press, no unnecessary attention. The remains were fragile, weather-worn, partially buried, but not forgotten. They sent the fragments to a lab specializing in degraded DNA. I didn't expect results. I'd learned not to. But when Nicole called the following week, her voice cracked just once. She said, "We found a match. It's Daniel." She didn't say anything else for a few seconds, and neither did I. There wasn't much to say. After all those years, the silence had finally given something back. Not answers, not yet, but something real. Something we could hold. And in a way, I still don't have words for that changed everything. The cause of death was undetermined. There were no signs of injury, no obvious trauma, just bones worn by time and weather. But they were his. The lab gave a 99.9% match to my DNA, and that was enough to bring him home. Enough to give my mother, who passed before ever getting this call, something she never had in her lifetime. A place to rest. I thought that would be the end of it, that the search was over. But as it turned out, that discovery opened more questions than it answered. Because once they looked again at where he was found and how far the body had been from the areas originally searched, people started to wonder. Not just about what Daniel might have been thinking that day, but whether someone else had followed him up there, or waited. There's a detail I hadn't thought about in decades. One of those odd things that surfaced briefly after Daniel vanished, then slipped out of view when bigger things took over. It came from a boy in the dorm. Next to his, he'd only spoken to Daniel once or twice, but remembered him because Daniel always took the same path back from the science building. Always the same. But that Friday afternoon, the boy said he saw him heading in the opposite direction toward the East Side Service Road. It struck him because it wasn't Daniel's usual route, and he remembered the green windbreaker, the same one Daniel wore when he left that morning. At the time, police wrote it down, maybe followed up with a map or two. But without security cameras or timestamps, it became one of a dozen theories pinned to the corkboard. Now, in 2024, it's something Heather and Nicole bring back up. That route, the one Daniel supposedly took that day, lines up with the narrow gravel pull-off hikers sometimes used to access the unmarked trail near Black Mountain. The same trail Steve remembered. The same area where the remains were found. Nicole dug up an old aerial photograph of the campus from the early 70s, long before the area was built out. She layered it with the topographic scans they'd used for the recovery site, and that's when something clicked. The distance between where Daniel's wallet was found and the trail entrance wasn't far, maybe a 10-minute walk. But in the 1973 reports, they were treated as two separate areas. Different search zones, different assumptions. One hinted at a possible abduction near campus. The other leaned towards someone choosing to walk into the foothills alone. No one had asked what might happen if both were true. Heather called me after reviewing the updated files. She didn't speculate, didn't press. But she did say something I hadn't considered before. If he was carrying his wallet when he left, and it was found behind the science building, What made him stop and drop it? I didn't have an answer. Neither did she. But the question stayed with me. The new forensic lab ran tests on the remains, what little they had. The skull fragments were too deteriorated to determine cause of death. No fractures, no marks that suggested a weapon, and no long bones to search for injuries or breaks. But there was one thing: soil samples embedded in the porous bone matched sediment from just below the summit line. Not the wooded slope, not the base where earlier searches focused. The upper ridge, the part no one had reached in the original search because the terrain was too steep and the path narrowed into loose shale. Hikers had passed through that area for years, but unless you knew what to look for, you wouldn't see anything unusual. What changed it all was the erosion. A heavy winter, followed by spring runoff, had peeled back just enough soil to expose the remains. If the snow had come early that year, or the trail been overgrown another few feet, it's likely he never would have been found at all. That led Heather to one more question. How did Daniel get there? Not just physically, but mentally. Did he hike up alone, thinking through something, chasing clarity? Or was he already in distress when he left campus that day? I've asked myself the same thing over and over. He never wrote about feeling overwhelmed. He never said he was unhappy. But then again, Daniel wasn't the kind of person to burden others. He held things in. He carried pressure quietly. When he was a teenager, he once wrote in the margin of his math book, "Everything should line up." I didn't understand it then. Now I think maybe that was his way of saying he needed things to make sense. And when they didn't, he didn't know where to put that feeling. Steve told Heather that Daniel had been withdrawn in the week leading up to his disappearance. Not sad exactly, just more focused, less talkative. He'd been reading more, skipping social events. A few classmates said the same. He wasn't unfriendly, but he seemed preoccupied. One professor noted that he'd missed a scheduled office hour without explanation. Small things, things that don't register at the time. But when you line them up afterward, they form a shape. The hardest part for me was admitting we might never know why. Not just how Daniel got there, but what he was thinking when he did. It's easy to imagine 100 versions. Maybe he went up the mountain to clear his head, to get space from whatever he was carrying. Maybe he slipped. Maybe it was an accident. But there was something about the way his wallet was found out in the open, almost too carefully placed, that made me question whether he ever intended to come back, or whether someone else wanted it to look that way. Heather hadn't ruled out foul play. She said that plainly. They were still considering all possibilities. That included the slim but real chance that Daniel had encountered someone on that trail, someone who didn't belong there. Nicole had gone back through missing persons reports, incident calls, even archived student complaints from that semester. There was nothing concrete, just whispers. One anonymous tip decades old about a man seen wandering the eastern trailhead late that same afternoon. A second report filed 6 months after Daniel vanished mentioned an unfamiliar vehicle parked near the gravel pull-off, no plate, no follow-up. Alone, neither detail held much weight. But together, they created space for doubt. They also recovered part of a zipper pull near the remains. It had corroded, worn down to a dark stub of metal. No brand, no tag, but consistent with the type used on windbreakers manufactured in the early 70s. Heather called me when the lab confirmed it. I didn't say anything for a long time. It wasn't a surprise. I already knew what it was. Daniel wore that jacket everywhere. The forest green one with the narrow sleeves and fraying hem. The one he left in that Friday morning. Sometimes it's not a dramatic revelation that moves a case forward. It's a small thing, a wrong turn, a zipper. A faint trail remembered by someone who never forgot. And sometimes those small things gather quietly until you can't ignore them anymore. Heather said they'd continue checking the ridge just in case there were more pieces buried farther in. More answers. I told her I'd be here. I've always been here. Because whether Daniel walked up that mountain looking for peace or never had the chance to come back down on his own, his story still wasn't finished. Not yet. The thing about Black Mountain is how quiet it is when you're up near the ridge. There's wind always, and the far-off rustle of pine needles shifting, but otherwise, it's just your breath and the steady crunch of gravel underfoot. That's what Heather described when she called me after returning from the initial site walk. She said it wasn't hard to imagine someone getting turned around up there. Trails split off loop back, fade into brush. The narrow footpath that led to where Daniel's remains were found was barely visible now, and it wasn't even a formal trail back then, just a game track widened over time by hikers, hunters, the occasional student looking for solitude. She told me it took 2 hours to reach that section, even with updated GPS and topographical maps. In 1973, it would have taken longer, maybe even twice as long if Daniel had hiked it alone. But what struck her more than the remoteness was the fact that even once you got there, you'd never know what lay beneath unless you were looking for it. After that conversation, I pulled out the box I hadn't opened in years. It had Daniel's old letters, some school photos, a few papers from the university that Mom had saved tuition receipts, orientation pamphlets. Tucked inside was a pocket calendar from 1973, the kind he used to keep in his backpack. Most of the squares were blank, but there were a few notes in his handwriting. October 10th, meet with Dr. Lewis, 3 p.m. October 11th, call home. That call never came. I found myself staring at the page for October 12th. It was empty, not even a scribble, just a square of silence where everything seemed to stop. Heather and Nicole started retracing everything from that day. Not just where Daniel had been, but who he might have past spoken to even briefly. There was a custodian listed in one of the remaining reports, a man named Raymond Conley, who'd worked the science building that fall. Heather tracked him down. He was retired now, living just outside Provo. He didn't remember much, but he did recall seeing a young man matching Daniel's description near the East Service Road that afternoon. He said the boy had been standing still, like he was waiting for someone. Not pacing, not looking at his watch, just standing there, alone. When Raymond passed again 20 minutes later, he was gone. There's a kind of ache that comes from hearing stories like that. Stories that might have meant something at the time if anyone had known. But no one had. That detail, one person standing then gone, was just another thread never tied to the rest. Until now. Nicole pulled weather records from that weekend. The temperature had dropped sharply that night, dipping below freezing just before dawn. No snowfall, but the wind chill up in the hills would have been severe. If Daniel had slipped or become disoriented after nightfall, it wouldn't have taken much for exposure to set in. Still, there were inconsistencies. For one, the location of the remains didn't align with what most hikers described as a common rest spot. It was slightly off the ridge path, down a shallow incline tucked between two boulders that acted almost like cover. A person would have had to leave the trail intentionally to reach that spot. It wasn't where someone would normally sit to take a break or enjoy the view. Which raised another question: if Daniel had chosen to go that way, why? And if he hadn't, if he'd been led or followed, who brought him there? Heather asked if there was anyone in Daniel's life who might have had a reason to hurt him. I told her the truth, not that I knew of. He didn't have enemies. He wasn't mixed up in anything dangerous. But I did mention something I'd always kept to myself, something that lingered longer than it should have. Back in '73, a few months before he vanished, Daniel had stopped writing to one of his high school friends. They'd exchanged letters their first year of college, but suddenly, Daniel went quiet. The friend reached out to me once, asking if he'd done something wrong. I didn't think much of it at the time. But looking back, I wonder if something had changed. If Daniel had pulled back for a reason he didn't want to share. Or couldn't. The more Heather and Nicole uncovered, the more they realized how much had been lost to time, not just evidence but possibilities. Leads that had gone cold before they were even noticed. And yet there were patterns. Small ones. Overlapping details that, when laid beside each other, began to suggest something. A second report surfaced from the university archives, undated, handwritten, nearly illegible. It referenced a vehicle parked along the eastern boundary road the same day Daniel disappeared. The make and model were never confirmed. The license plate box was left blank. But the officer's note read, "Unfamiliar sedan, early '70s, green or gray." Gone when checked again at 5:40 p.m. It might have meant nothing, or it might have been the one detail no one followed up on. Heather marked it anyway. She told me she was going to start contacting retired faculty from that year, just in case someone else remembered anything. Most of them had long since moved away or passed on, but a few still responded. One recalled that in the weeks after Daniel vanished, there had been rumors about an older man seen near the student dorms, someone who didn't work at the university, but seemed to be there often. No name, no clear description. Just the kind of shadow detail that shows up in stories told too late. I asked Heather what came next. She said they were planning to send a team back up to Black Mountain before winter set in again. This time, they'd searched the surrounding slope thoroughly. Not just the site where Daniel was found, but the whole southern face. It would take time, resources, and there were no guarantees. But they weren't done. Not yet. I hung up the phone and sat in the quiet for a long time. Outside, the leaves were turning again, same way they had the year he left. I thought about the things Daniel never got to do, the life he never finished, the part of me that still listens for his voice when the house is too still. And I thought about Heather, Nicole, Steve, all of them. People who could have looked away, but didn't. And then, just as I was turning off the light, the phone rang again. Not the department this time. A man's voice. Older. Careful. He said he used to live near the university. Said he remembered something about that week in October, something he hadn't told anyone. Not back then, not ever. He asked if I had a minute. I said yes. His voice was slower than I expected. Clear but hesitant, like he hadn't spoken the name in a long time and wasn't sure if it would land right. He introduced himself as Henry Grayson. Said he used to live in an apartment just off 9th East, about 5 blocks from the university, back in the early '70s. He worked part-time at a supply warehouse on weekends and did odd jobs during the week. Nothing fancy. He wasn't a student, he wasn't staff. But he walked through campus almost daily, cutting across the edge of the dorm complex on his way to and from the bus stop. That's how he remembered the boy in the green jacket. Not his face exactly, but the way he stood still centered, like he was waiting for something. Henry said it wasn't the first time he saw him there. Maybe the third or fourth. Always in the same place between the East Road and the small grove of trees where students sometimes ate lunch when the weather held. He never approached him, just noticed. And then on Friday, October 12th, 1973, late afternoon, he passed again. And this time, the boy wasn't alone. He described the man as older mid-30s, maybe wearing a dark field coat and khaki slacks. Not a student, not someone he'd seen on campus before. He said the man had a clipboard or folder tucked under his arm and sunglasses pushed up on his head. They weren't arguing, nothing loud or strange. But the boy, the one Henry believed was Daniel, seemed uncertain. Shifting his weight, looking off toward the trees. The man kept gesturing in the direction of the service road. Eventually, they both walked that way down the hill and out of sight. Henry didn't think much of it at the time. He had a shift that night and didn't hear about the disappearance until days later. When he did, he wasn't sure it was the same kid. He kept telling himself it was probably someone else. But after seeing the university's public statement about the case reopening and reading the update in the paper about remains being found near the summit, he couldn't shake the memory. He said he wasn't sure what help he could offer after all these years, but he thought someone should know. I passed his name along to Heather. She followed up the next morning. Ran his background. Clean. No criminal record. Nothing to gain from coming forward. She asked if he'd be willing to speak to campus police officially. He said yes. Gave the same account. No embellishment, no new detail. Just the same careful, steady story he'd told me. She logged it, added it to the timeline. And then she said something I hadn't heard in a long time. If he's telling the truth, and I believe he is, then Daniel didn't walk into those hills alone. That changed everything. The theory that Daniel had slipped away quietly, overwhelmed, or despairing, had always rested on the idea that no one else had seen him leave, that the hike was solitary, that his decision, whatever it was, had been made in silence. But now we had a new piece. Not proof, not yet, but a contradiction, a presence. Someone older, unnamed, unexplained. Nicole went back to the notes from 73, combed them again for any mention of faculty or staff who might have fit the description. She turned up a single complaint filed anonymously the semester Daniel disappeared. Something about an unaffiliated adult male seen lingering near the dorm lounges. No follow-up report, no identifying information. Just a note in the margin. No students involved. Not a threat. She pulled campus ID records from that period. Compared yearbook photos. Nothing matched. Then she started checking local businesses within walking distance. The campus bookstore. The corner diner. A barbershop where students sometimes got $10 cuts. She was looking for a paper trail, receipts, logs, anything that might suggest who the man could have been. Heather, meanwhile, submitted the case update to a statewide cold case task force. It wasn't a formal handoff, just a way to widen the net. Ask for eyes on any open cases from the 70s involving student disappearances, suspicious activity, or unidentified persons seen near university grounds. One detective from Logan responded. Said the account reminded him of a separate file in an abandoned car found near a canyon trailhead in 1974, with no matching report or claim. too far north to be directly related, but close enough in timing to raise a brow. No evidence ever tied it to Daniel's case. But it added another ripple in the same pattern. Things that didn't fit. Things that were noticed too late. I found myself lying awake again, thinking about the field coat, the sunglasses, the way Henry described the man gesturing not urgently, but with purpose. Like he had something to show, something he wanted Daniel to follow. And Daniel, always polite, always unsure how to say no, might have followed without fully understanding why. Maybe he thought it was someone from the university, a professor, an assistant, someone needing help or offering something. Maybe he was caught off guard. Maybe he didn't have a choice. That thought stayed with me for days. Heather warned me not to leap too far ahead. It was still speculation. They hadn't confirmed anything. No identity, no records. Just an old man's memory and a story we couldn't yet place. But it was something. And when you've gone this long without answers, something is enough to keep going. They planned to send another team up the mountain the following week. A more thorough scan this time. Deeper terrain, denser underbrush. There were still sections of that southern ridge no one had touched. Nicole said it was a long shot. But sometimes, long shots are the only ones you get. And then, just as that search was being scheduled, another call came in. Not from a neighbor, not from a witness. This time, it was from an archivist. A woman working in the basement of the state library digitizing old university records. She said she'd found a sealed folder in the back of a university housing drawer, misfiled and forgotten. Dated October 1973. One name on the tab, not Daniel's, but someone else. Someone who worked for the university back then. Unofficially. The archivist's name was Denise Harrow. She'd been working through old housing logs from the university's Central Records Department, mostly routine material floor plans, lease dates, maintenance rosters from the 70s. But what she'd found, tucked in the back of an unlabeled storage drawer, was a slim red file with no barcode and no digital trace in the university's inventory. It wasn't stored with the rest of the campus files, but had somehow been grouped in with property records. It was marked in faded pen C. Bellamy, 1973 to 74. That name meant nothing to Denise, but she scanned a few pages and saw something odd. A staff scheduling sheet for on-call maintenance workers. The name Calvin Bellamy was listed on several weekends, including October 12th. But there was no employee number, no payroll record, no supervisor signature, just a name printed in block letters over and over again, and an address that matched a boarding house that was torn down decades ago. Heather and Nicole followed up immediately. They searched every internal file, asked around, reached out to retired custodial staff. No one remembered the name. No ID badge had ever been issued to a Calvin Bellamy by the university. But his name appeared in the log as someone who had access to the service tunnels beneath the eastern dormitories. At the time, those tunnels weren't restricted. Some were even used for storage. But anyone who worked around them regularly would have known how to move across campus without being seen from above. They'd also know the best places to wait near dorm entrances, shaded corners, utility exits, alleys that emptied into overgrown paths. If Bellamy had been using a university cover even informally, that might explain why students saw him but didn't report anything. He could have looked like he belonged, like he was fixing something, delivering something, even just passing through. Nicole kept digging. She contacted the city clerk's office to request any available records tied to the name. There were no property purchases, no taxes filed. but a handwritten tenant log surfaced from a rooming house 2 blocks from campus, one of those barely regulated places that rented by the week mostly to laborers and transients. There on a faded index card was the name again. C. Bellamy. No first name listed this time. Just male, estimated age 35 to 40. Occupation left blank. He stayed for 3 weeks. Moved out October 15th, 1973. 3 days after Daniel vanished. Heather called me once they confirmed the address. Her voice was as even as ever, but slower. He would have been living within walking distance of the university. Close enough to observe students. Close enough to see patterns. Close enough to notice Daniel walking alone or sitting in the same spot near the trees after class. She didn't speculate on motive. She just said they were requesting background on anyone named Bellamy arrested in the state between 1974 and 1985, hoping maybe the name popped up again somewhere else. But there was no match. Whoever he was, he disappeared just as easily as he came. That didn't stop the investigation. If anything, it sharpened it. They cross-checked Daniel's classmates' staff guest logs, anyone who might have had a connection even indirectly. One name surfaced in a roundabout way. A student at the time briefly questioned in 1973 because he'd been cited for trespassing near the maintenance garages the week before Daniel's disappearance. His name was Alan Vickers. He told officers he'd been cutting through the lot to avoid a longer walk. It wasn't a major incident. The report was marked resolved and never followed up on, but Nicole flagged it anyway. Vickers had dropped out shortly after the fall semester ended and never re-enrolled. When they tried to track him down now, 50 years later, they found he'd passed away in 2009. No known connection to Bellamy. No link to Daniel. But it was another trail, brief unresolved, easily dismissed. I found myself thinking about the way the story had unfolded all these years. Not in one big moment, but in fragments. A wallet found too clean. A jacket never recovered. A search that had missed the ridge by a few hundred yards. And now a man who might have had access to the edges of Daniel's world without anyone really noticing. Maybe Bellamy was nobody. Maybe he was just a man who needed work and left no mark. But maybe he wasn't. Maybe he was the reason Daniel walked away from the familiar path that Friday. Maybe he was the reason Daniel's footsteps led upward toward a place no one thought to look until decades later. The forensic team went back to the ridge before the first snow of the season. They used new equipment this time, ground-penetrating radar specialized thermal drones. What they found wasn't conclusive. A patch of disturbed soil just west of the original recovery site. The remains of what might have been an old tarp, mostly decomposed, impossible to date. And half buried beneath a stone ledge, a small metal button tarnished almost beyond recognition. Heather sent it to the lab. A week later, results came back. It matched the design used on windbreaker cuffs manufactured by a brand Daniel favored. The same style he'd worn the day he disappeared. It was one more confirmation, one more piece, but it didn't answer what we still didn't know. Did he go up there with someone? Or did someone follow him? I don't think we'll ever be able to say with certainty what happened after he stepped onto that trail. But we know now that he didn't just vanish. He was seen. He was followed. And maybe he was chosen. Heather told me they were closing out this phase of the search soon. Unless new information came in, there was little more they could recover from the site. But she also said something I didn't expect. She said Daniel's case had quietly changed things. The university, prompted in part by Steve Warren's persistence over the years, had instituted a new policy. If a student stops attending classes for 2 semesters in a row and hasn't formally withdrawn their name gets flagged, a staff member is required to make contact, not to accuse, just to ask. Are you okay? Do you need help? Are you still here? It's not much, but it's something. Something I wish had existed in 1973. Something that might have meant Daniel's name didn't sit in a drawer for 50 years before anyone asked what happened to him. And now, after all this time, we have a place to visit. A stone near the tree line on Black Mountain. A name etched into granite. Not just a question anymore. A presence. A life. A brother I can finally bring flowers to and say his name out loud without it disappearing into silence. But even now, I don't think we've heard the last of Calvin Bellamy. There's a small plaque now at the trailhead near Black Mountain. It's not a memorial exactly, just a quiet marker, noting that a student was found there nearly 5 decades after he went missing. Most hikers pass by without stopping. Some pause, read the name, maybe wonder what kind of boy he was. But for me, and for a few others who remember that spot, is something else. It's the point where the silence broke, where what was lost finally came into view. Daniel was 20 when he vanished. Quiet. Kind. Always thinking a few steps ahead, even if he didn't say it out loud. I spent years trying to imagine what might have gone through his mind that afternoon, whether he followed someone willingly, whether he meant to return. But now, I've let that go. Not because I've stopped wondering, but because I finally understand that some questions stay open no matter how long you wait for answers. Heather Starnes kept her word. When the case reached the end of what could be known, she didn't force it closed. She filed it, honestly remains identified cause, undetermined evidence of possible third-party involvement, inconclusive. Nicole Mitchell stayed on too. She helped organize the records for long-term preservation so the gaps and failures of 1973 wouldn't be repeated. Dr. Stephen Warren came to the site once, stood beside me in the dry pine light. He didn't say much, just looked out across the ridge, hands in his pockets. He was a good kid, he said. I nodded. That was enough. The name Calvin Bellamy never turned up again. No fingerprints. No confirmed sightings. It's possible he was never real, or that the name was a lie to begin with. But I don't need to chase him anymore. If he was responsible, then he carried that truth with him all these years. And if he's still out there, this story being told is its own kind of reckoning. Daniel's windbreaker was never found. Just a zipper, a button, and the spot where his bones were finally allowed to rest. We held a service that fall. Just family and a few people who had stood by through the long wait. I read a letter Daniel wrote to me when I was 17. It was about a book he'd loved, some physics text I didn't understand. But at the end, he'd written one sentence that stayed with me. I think all things leave some kind of echo even after they're gone. That line is carved into the stone. I still walk. Not far, not like I used to, but sometimes I go to the edge of the woods behind my neighborhood and sit on the bench that faces west. The wind sounds the same. The trees don't ask questions. And once in a while, when the sky is just the right kind of blue, I feel like he's nearby, not as a mystery, but as memory, as something full and real. If you've listened this far, thank you. Thank you for giving your time to a story that never got a proper ending until now. And if this stayed with you, maybe share it. Speak a name that once went quiet, so someone else somewhere might feel a little less alone.